The bitter melon above the city. At the top of a crowded city building, far above the traffic and concrete, there was a small rooftop garden. It was not a perfect garden. There were no wide fields, no rich country soil, and no endless rows of vegetables. There were only containers, a few raised beds, a simple trellis, and a gardener trying to make the most of every square foot of space. But in the heat of summer, one plant seemed made for this place. Bitter melon. Known in many parts of Asia as bitter gourd, and scientifically as Mamordica carrantia, bitter melon is a tropical climbing vine that seems almost designed for vertical gardens. Give it warmth, strong sunlight, enough water, and something to climb, and it can quickly transform a bare rooftop into a wall of green. Its thin tendrils reach outward, searching for support. Its deeply divided leaves spread across the trellis. And once the plant becomes established, new shoots can appear almost every day. For an urban gardener, this is part of the attraction. A bitter melon plant does not need a large piece of land. It needs height. A railing, a net, a fence, or a simple trellis can turn unused vertical space into productive growing area. Instead of spreading across the floor, the vine climbs toward the sun. And under hot tropical conditions, it can grow with remarkable speed. At first, the gardener on this rooftop thought the formula was simple. Sunlight, water, fertilizer. What else could a vigorous tropical vine possibly need? For several weeks, everything seemed to confirm that idea. The leaves became larger. The vines became longer. The entire trellis slowly disappeared behind dense green growth. From a distance, the plant looked magnificent. But something was missing. There were almost no fruits. And even the flowers seemed strangely disappointing. The gardener had created an impressive wall of leaves, but not the harvest that had been expected. This was the first lesson the bitter melon would teach. A plant can look healthy and still be out of balance. The first mystery, too much green. When gardeners see a plant growing slowly, one of the first instincts is often to feed it. A little fertilizer produces growth, so more fertilizer can feel like a logical solution. But plants do not work that way. Nitrogen is especially important for leafy growth. It helps plants produce chlorophyll, proteins, enzymes, and new vegetative tissue. A nitrogen-starved vine may look pale and weak. But too much available nitrogen can push a plant in the opposite direction. The vine may produce an abundance of dark green leaves and long shoots, while flowering and fruiting become less productive. That was exactly what had happened on the rooftop. The gardener had been feeding the bitter melon generously with a fertilizer rich in nitrogen. The result looked impressive. Thick foliage, rapid growth, long vines. But the plant was investing heavily in stems and leaves. For a fruiting crop, the goal is not simply to create the largest plant possible. The goal is to maintain a balance between vegetative growth and reproduction. The gardener stopped adding high nitrogen fertilizer. Instead of trying to force more growth, the plant was allowed to settle into a more balanced feeding routine. There was another detail to understand. Bitter melon produces separate male and female flowers on the same plant. Male flowers usually appear first and are often more numerous. Female flowers can be recognized by the tiny immature fruit located directly behind the flower. That tiny swelling is the beginning of a bitter melon. But a female flower alone does not guarantee a fruit. Pollination must occur. In an open garden, bees and other insects normally carry pollen from male flowers to female flowers. On a high urban rooftop, however, pollinator activity may be inconsistent. So the gardener began watching the flowers in the morning. A freshly opened male flower could be used for hand pollination. Its pollen could be gently transferred to the center of a newly opened female flower. It was a small action. But sometimes the difference between a flower that falls and a fruit that begins to grow is simply successful pollination. Within days, the rooftop garden started to change. Tiny green fruits began appearing beneath the fading flowers. The gardener had solved the first mystery. Or so it seemed. The second mystery, fruit that fails. A young bitter melon is a strange and beautiful thing. At first, it may be no larger than a finger. Its surface is already textured with the bumps and ridges that will become more dramatic as the fruit expands. Every morning, the gardener inspected the vines. Several fruits were growing quickly. Then one began to deteriorate. Another developed damage. One fruit split. It was tempting to blame a single missing nutrient. Calcium is important in plant cell walls and healthy tissue development. And problems with calcium movement can contribute to physiological disorders in many fruiting crops. But calcium problems are often more complicated than simply asking whether calcium exists in the soil. Plants move calcium mainly through water flowing from the roots. That means root health, soil moisture, salinity, temperature, and the overall growing environment can influence whether developing tissues receive enough calcium. And fruit cracking itself can have several causes. One of the most common is inconsistent water availability. Imagine a container becoming unusually dry during a hot rooftop afternoon. The fruit's growth slows. Then the gardener gives the plant a large amount of water. The roots suddenly absorb moisture, and the fruit begins expanding quickly. If the outer tissue cannot stretch fast enough, cracking can occur. So instead of immediately treating every damaged fruit as proof of calcium deficiency, the gardener began with the foundation. Watering became more consistent. The soil was checked before watering rather than watered automatically. On a rigid schedule. Drainage holes were kept open. A layer of mulch helped reduce rapid moisture loss from the container. The gardener also paid attention to the growing medium. Container vegetables depend entirely on the small volume of soil provided to them. Unlike plants growing in open ground, their roots cannot simply travel farther in search of nutrients and moisture. That makes balance especially important. The gardener wanted a slow source of calcium for the soil and had plenty of clean eggshells from the kitchen. The shells were washed, dried, and crushed as finely as possible before being incorporated into the growing medium. Eggshells contain a large amount of calcium carbonate. But there was an important limitation. They are not an instant rescue treatment. Coarse pieces can take a long time to break down, and even finely ground. Eggshell is better understood as a slow soil amendment than as an emergency cure for a fruit that is already damaged. The gardener accepted that the damaged fruits would not magically repair themselves. The real objective was to improve conditions for the fruits that came next. Balanced nutrition. Healthy roots. Steady moisture. Good drainage. And patience. That combination was far more useful than chasing a single miracle ingredient. Soon, new fruits began developing. They were firm. Their color was strong. Their growth was steady. For a few peaceful days, it seemed that the difficult part was over. Then another enemy arrived. The silent attack. The first sign was almost invisible. A tiny mark on the surface of a young fruit. Nothing dramatic. No large hole. No obvious caterpillar. No swarm of insects. The gardener almost ignored it. A few days later, the fruit began to soften. Inside, the damage was much worse than it appeared from the outside. Fruit flies can be serious pests of bitter melon and other cucurbit crops in warm climates. Adult females can puncture young fruit and lay eggs beneath the surface. The larvae then feed inside the developing fruit, where they are protected from many treatments applied to the outside. By the time the damage becomes obvious, saving that fruit may already be impossible. This creates a frustrating situation. The vine can be healthy. Pollination can be successful. Nutrition can be balanced. The fruit can begin growing beautifully. And then one tiny puncture can ruin weeks of work. The gardener did not want to depend on routine insecticide spraying. So the strategy changed from fighting the pest after it entered the fruit to preventing access in the first place. The solution was surprisingly simple. A small protective bag. Once a young fruit had been successfully pollinated and had begun to enlarge, the gardener covered it with a breathable mesh or suitable fruit protection bag. The bag was loose enough to allow the fruit to expand. Air could circulate. Light could still reach the fruit. But the physical barrier made it much harder for fruit flies to reach the surface and lay eggs. It took only seconds for each fruit. Yet this small habit could dramatically reduce damage when done at the right time. Bagging alone was not the entire strategy. Damaged or fallen fruits were removed from the growing area instead of being left nearby, where developing larvae could continue the pest cycle. The rooftop was kept clean. The gardener also watched for pest activity and understood that traps can sometimes be used as part of an integrated management approach. No single method guarantees perfect protection. But physical exclusion, sanitation, monitoring, and early action together can make an enormous difference. The lesson was simple. Sometimes the best way to defeat a garden pest is not to kill it. It is to deny it the opportunity to attack. The vertical king. As the weeks passed, the bitter melon vine reached the top of the trellis. Then it began spreading sideways. From the street below, nobody would have guessed that a productive vegetable garden existed above the building. Up there, among concrete walls and water tanks, the vine had created its own green canopy. This was where the biology of bitter melon became especially useful. As a climbing plant, it is remarkably efficient in small spaces. Its tendrils allow it to anchor itself to supports. Training the vine upward improves access to light and keeps many fruits suspended above the soil. It can also make harvesting and inspection easier. But dense growth has disadvantages. If leaves become too crowded, airflow can decline. That can create humid pockets around the foliage, especially during wet weather. The gardener occasionally removed damaged or badly crowded leaves and guided wandering shoots back toward the trellis. The goal was not to strip the plant. Leaves are solar panels. They capture the light that powers growth. The goal was simply to maintain a structure that allowed sunlight and air to move through the vine. The rooftop itself created another challenge. Heat. Containers can become much hotter and dry out much faster than garden soil. A bitter melon may enjoy warm weather, but its roots still need a reasonably stable environment. So the gardener learned to think not only about the plant above the soil, but also about the invisible world inside the container. Roots need water. But they also need oxygen. A permanently waterlogged container can suffocate roots. A completely dry container can stress the plant and interrupt nutrient transport. The healthiest condition lies somewhere between those extremes. Moist, but not constantly saturated. Well drained, but not repeatedly bone dry. Gardening, the bitter melon seemed to say, was an art of balance. The final test, when to harvest. Eventually, the protected fruits became impossible to ignore. They hung from the trellis like green lanterns. Some were short and thick. Others were longer and more slender. Their exact appearance depended on the variety, but all carried the distinctive textured surface that makes bitter melon immediately recognizable. Now the gardener faced the final question. When should they be harvested? Waiting for the largest possible fruit can be a mistake. Bitter melon changes rapidly as it matures. For most culinary uses, the fruit is harvested while still green, firm, and immature. As it becomes fully ripe, the color shifts toward yellow or orange. The fruit softens. Eventually it may split open naturally, revealing seeds surrounded by vivid red arrows. That stage is fascinating if the goal is seed saving or simply observing the plant's full life cycle. But it is usually beyond the preferred stage for cooking. So the gardener stopped judging the fruit by size alone. Color mattered. Firmness mattered. The characteristic surface texture mattered. And experience mattered. A good harvest window was when the fruit had reached the expected size. For its variety but was still green and firm, before obvious yellowing and softening began. The gardener lifted one fruit gently in one hand. It felt solid. The skin was richly green. There was no sign of softening. This was the moment. Instead of pulling or twisting the fruit from the vine, the gardener used clean, sharp scissors to cut the stem. The fruit came away easily. The vine remained undamaged. After weeks of observation, mistakes, corrections, and waiting, the first perfect bitter melon rested in the gardener's hand. But the harvest was not really the end of the story. It was evidence. Evidence that the gardener had finally learned to read the plant. What the bitter melon was saying. A garden does not speak in words. It speaks through leaves. Through flowers. Through roots. Through insects. Through fruit. Dark green foliage and endless vine growth may be telling you that nitrogen is too abundant. Flowers that fail to become fruit may be telling you to look at pollination. Fruit damage may be telling you to examine water consistency, root conditions, nutrition, or pests instead of reaching immediately for a single cure. A tiny puncture may reveal the presence of an enemy that spends most of its destructive life hidden inside the fruit. And a fruit turning yellow may simply be telling you that the harvest window is closing. The gardener on the rooftop had begun the season believing that growing bitter melon was about controlling a plant. By the end, the lesson was different. Successful gardening was less about control and more about observation. The plant already knew how to climb. It already knew how to search for sunlight. It already knew how to flower and produce fruit. The gardener's job was to create the conditions that allowed those natural processes to work. Enough sun. Enough root space. Consistent moisture. Balanced nutrition. Pollination. Protection from pests. And harvesting at the right moment. None of these actions was particularly complicated. The difficult part was knowing when each one mattered. The rooftop harvest. By late afternoon, the sun had softened. The concrete buildings around the garden began casting long shadows. Leaves moved gently in the warm air. Several bitter melons still hung beneath the trellis, each one protected. Inside its light mesh covering, the gardener walked slowly between the containers. There was no large farm here. No tractor. No greenhouse filled with expensive equipment. Just a rooftop. A trellis. Some soil. A climbing vine. And knowledge gathered one problem at a time. That may be one of the most satisfying things about growing food in a city. A small space can still teach enormous lessons. The bitter melon had transformed an empty wall into living shade. It had turned sunlight into leaves, flowers, and food. It had attracted insects, demanded attention, survived mistakes, and rewarded patience. And every challenge had revealed something about how plants actually live. Too much fertilizer had shown that more is not always better. Fruit problems had shown the importance of water and root health. Fruit flies had demonstrated the power of prevention. Harvesting had taught the gardener that timing matters just as much as growth. The first bitter melon was carried downstairs toward the kitchen. Behind it, the vine remained on the rooftop, still climbing, still flowering, still producing. Tomorrow there would be more flowers to inspect. More young fruits to protect. More soil to check. Perhaps another problem to solve. That is the quiet truth of gardening. There is never a moment when we understand everything. There is only the next observation. The next adjustment. The next season. And sometimes, above a noisy city, all of that knowledge begins with one small green vine reaching for the sun.